Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Erasmus Expeditions. Tonight with episode 11 of the Help Action series here on the channel, part of the Life by the Square Inch series. This is one part interview, one part question and answer, one part topic discussion. And tonight we are going to be discussing building backstories. And I am very, very happy and excited to welcome my guest. Most of you who are watching this probably at least recognize her to some extent. So V, you son of a bitch, how are you?
I'm good. How about you?
Doing good. Doing
Awesome.
good. Like I said, it's been a busy week so far, but it's all been busy with gaming, which is a good way to be busy as far as I'm concerned.
Agreed.
Awesome. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell people where they can find you, plug what you want, etc.
Whatever I want, however I want, whenever I want.
Sure.
Do I have a time limit?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be on here for an hour,
right,
so
I can take 49 minutes. There you go. Hi, everyone. I'm V. I have the YouTube channel, The Crafting Muse, where you can go over and check out tips on how to make terrain, paint miniatures, and game accessories. Also a very active player on both Mini Terrain Domains Twitch channel as well as Scraticus Academy. I'm there regularly for both of them, and I love it. And I'm very much looking forward to sitting down with Jeremy and chatting with him, because normally we get to play every Thursday night. Except it's our PCs who do the most interacting, and we don't exactly get along with our PCs. They do. They just like to pick on each other.
Very much a sibling rivalry.
Very much so. Dwarf.
With a little bit of racism kind of sprinkled in, you know, because
just a touch, you know.
Elves and dwarves.
Yeah, exactly. You know, but it's mostly tongue in cheek.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun. Whenever I started doing this series of videos, I knew that I wanted to have you on that's for something, and I didn't want to just do crafting because that's what everybody interviews you for. So I wanted to do something a little bit different, and I'm glad that we kind of were able to find a topic easily that we could both talk about. And yeah, so if you're tuning in this evening, thank you very much. If you have a question, go ahead and drop it in the chat, and we will try to get to it at some point throughout the evening. So first up, one of the first questions that I love to ask leading out is, when and how did you find gaming?
When and how?
How did you get into this weird little hobby?
Well, let's see. The first foray into the sort of RPG factor was back in college when my husband and I, we weren't married yet, so my then boyfriend and I, he introduced me to Baldur's Gate on the PlayStation 2. Dating myself. So I fell in love with playing that video game. It was so much fun. We must have played it like 5 times over, like literally would complete and then reboot, create new characters, and go through again. So that kind of got me going on that. And then, you know, life happens. You have to do the adulting thing. Kids come into the picture and everything like that. So playing the video game stuff sort of fell to the wayside. And then, like 3.5, 4 years ago, time gets fuzzy. He started doing Dungeons and Dragons 3.5-ish with our boys, because I was out for the count after a back surgery, and he was being Mr. Mom, and he was, you know, trying to keep them entertained for that summer vacation. And he thought, hey, I'm going to teach them how to play. And they were getting a kick out of it. And then he'd come upstairs at night where I was in bed recuperating, and he actually would come up with paper crafts. And he'd sit there, and I'd sit there with the scissors, and I'd cut out the paper crafts, and then he would put them together, is what would be happening. And as I'm cutting this out, I'm like, well, what's this going to be? And well, what are you using it for? And he'd tell me all this stuff. And then the light bulb went on in my head. I'm like, wait a minute, this is kind of like Baldur's Gate. Like when we played Baldur's Gate, he goes, well, yes, because. But I was always one of those kids who was forever book in hand, always reading, ever since I was little, and I was always drawn to the fantasy literature stuff. So for me, when we started talking more about Dungeons and Dragons, I realized, wait a minute, this is like that series and this book that I read and that book that I read. So all the things he was talking about were very much familiar stories. And I was an English teacher for a while. So, you know, again, it was teaching Greek mythology and world literature and everything like that. So I'm like, these are worlds I know, and these are worlds I love. So I want in. So once I was feeling good enough, he helped me pull together my first character. Her name was Gwendolyn Lightfoot, druid halfling. Or no, she was a druid gnome, and jumped into the campaign he was doing, the boys, midway. She had a panther as her animal companion. And it was just, we had so much fun together as a family playing, and it just sort of like kept going and kept building. And the crafting part kicked in too as a result, because he went from the paper crafts to doing some more of like the more basic crafts. And I've always been a crafty person. Like I literally had my first sewing machine at 5 years old. It was a Holly hobby machine. So seeing him make these things, I'm like, wait a minute, this is stuff I used to do as a kid for like my dolls and Barbie dolls and stuff. Let me in. So I jumped in and I started making things for our table too. And the playing and the creating just sort of took off from there, and it's been going ever since.
It's awesome. I've always loved hearing people's stories of how they came to the various parts of this hobby, because it's always different.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody kind of ends up more or less in the same place. You know, people have different styles of gaming that they prefer and whatnot. But for the most part, we've all arrived at this very niche hobby. And, you know, you and I and several other people that we know, even more so, you know, crafting, you know, tabletop terrain and things of that nature. It's a very small group of people to find yourself in. And, you know, you have people who, like you come from, you know, making crafts and things from being a child, and, you know, people who like Pillow Pal was like a contractor, you know, and so he brings it like it from an architectural background. And, you know, Wylock is all engineering. So all of his measurements are insanely precise. And
yeah, you don't say.
yeah. So it's just awesome to see how all of these different paths kind of lead to the same place. That's really cool. And gaming with your family is amazing.
I love it.
It's a really cool experience. So a great way to connect. As a matter of fact, I have a follow-up question. So knowing that you game frequently with your family, what is it that you hope gaming is doing for your children? How do you see this hobby building the backstory for the character of your children?
I'm actually already seeing it. There's no hope to it. I'm seeing them just from schoolwork. Their math abilities, they're ridiculous. The teachers have both contacted me and be like, oh, he's doing so well with math. I have 2 boys, which is why I'm using general he. And I can't believe how quickly he can add and do this and that and the other thing. And it's like, well, because, you know, they do their roles and we make them do the math. Sometimes we even make them do our own math because, you know, hey, you could do it for me. One's like a little human calculator. He's like, da-da-da, and zips it right out. I mean, he had a magic missile level 7. I'm like, how did you do all that? Like, just like there. So mathematically, it definitely strengthens, and it helps them in leaps and bounds. And then in terms of the whole building the story and working together throughout the campaign, like you can see that with their own writing workshops, or not workshops, but the writing works that they have to do at school and things, they're getting very creative. They're getting very descriptive, and they're not just like, you know, so-and-so has a blue sweater, so-and-so likes their blue sweater. Like there's details, there's continuation, there's concepts that they have built into their own writing, again, because of doing the whole role-playing part and working through the campaign. And I think the biggest thing has been their ability to work well with others. That's the one thing the teachers have all mentioned, is like, you put them into groups and they're so great. They sit down and they sort of like, you know, make sure everyone's got something to do and everyone's, you know, feeling like they're a part of it, and they give and they take. And it's like, well, okay, great. So it's one of those things where people think, oh, you're playing a game. It's no, you're not playing a game. Well, yes, you are, but you're also giving them, well, it's that sneaky thing. You're teaching them to do something without them realizing it. So they're getting those life skills. They're learning the mathematics. They're learning the different techniques in writing. They're learning how to work together in a group and how to deal with conflicts and how to use foreshadowing and pick up on, you know, little hints and tips that are coming from the DM and things like that. So I am a huge advocate of getting kids into the game and getting them to play. And it's not something I will be shy about that. In fact, if you give me time, I will sit here and stay on my soapbox quite stubbornly. But I absolutely love seeing what it's done for them. It's to the point now where the one, he sits down and he takes out the player's handbook. He takes out the monster manual. He takes out the sword coast. He takes out Xanathar's. And I think he creates a new PC every couple weeks for no other reason than he just wants to create a PC. The other one has now created 4 games of his own that he will DM for the younger one. Kid you not. He's got one that's Pokemon. He's got one that is set Faerun based, but it's a funky little concept. He built it around the little ones, one of the little ones' PCs. So they're both very much into the working and creating and developing, and because they're having fun with it, they just want to keep doing it. But because they're practicing and creating and constantly going with it, it's helping them get better and better and better and better. which is why, you know, if people say, oh, I have a 3-year-old, I think that's too young. Nope. You can absolutely get them in there. You just don't expect them to sit there quietly the whole time. Give them a PC where it's like, oh, you know, it's this mischievous little gnome who jumps in and jumps out every so often, but they get to do something to help out the group. So it's there's little tweaks you can make as a parent with the kids to have them get into doing things and have them learning how to do it age appropriate. Yeah, you kind of have to fix things where it's like, I think when my husband first started doing it, it wasn't that she would kill the monsters would sort of like poof into dust and disappear, and they've been conquered for now until like the next party comes along and they have to fulfill the quest type of concept. And then once they got older and realizing they kind of understood the concept of death better, that's where it worked into, oh yeah, you slayed the whatever the big bad guy was at that point. But yeah, I think gaming and playing out characters and stuff like that, it's hugely a wonderful experience for kids.
I couldn't agree more. Whenever I was about 13, we moved from one school district to another, and the school district that I had moved to was a year behind, and that happened right when I was entering algebra. So I missed out on pre-algebra. And right around the same time, I also started playing for the first time, about 14. And the arithmetic, just the simple math, you know, addition, subtraction, simple multiplication and division, was something that wasn't sharpened enough to help with algebra, because you have to have all that kind of stuff down packed in order to really kind of go on to algebra. But D&D absolutely helped me in that arena. I can do so much better now with mental math. And yeah, and agreed. Leadership is such a paramount concept in D&D. Teamwork, problem solving, all of these skills in life that it's difficult to learn elsewhere, especially as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll teach it to you in spades if you're paying attention, and you really want a lot out of the game instead of just killing every monster you come across. So yeah, I absolutely am an advocate for gaming with families. My wife is running us, my son and I, through a Dark Crystal campaign that we just started a little while ago, and it's an absolute blast. It's very, very fun. And occasionally I run a game for some of my cousin's kids and my son. We use a simplified set of the rules, and we only play for about an hour and a half. That's about all their attention span is usually good for. But that's actually where I really took a dive into terrain crafting, was for that game.
Mm-hmm.
And it's since kind of taken over my life.
yeah, because they're so visual. It helps to have that terrain and the minis and everything out there for them to work with, and all that loveliness, for sure.
Absolutely. Okay, so my last question, directed specifically at you, actually has to do with crafting, because in the community at large, you're known, of course, as the Crafting Muse, and for hosting your channel, which focuses on building terrain for tabletop gaming. So what benefit, aside from the one that you just mentioned, is it that you think terrain grants to a session? And is it possible for a GM to utilize these benefits in order to kind of build the backstory of their campaign or their setting through terrain?
I think when it comes to, especially when it's you and I both play in streams, so it's a different story. But when you have a situation where people are just coming in, especially if they're fresh and new to the game itself, like they've never played before, having something tangible on the table helps them look and associate with the environment. Like they'll look and be like, oh wait, this is a castle. This is like a place that I've seen in pictures, or maybe they've visited a castle, and suddenly this ethereal concept of, oh well, this world far, far away isn't such a far, far away. It's like, no, this is kind of like X, Y, and Z that I've been exposed to before. And as soon as people are able to start connecting and relating to the environment, I find especially it's a lot easier for them to realize, well, you know, my character would probably be someone like this who would interact like that because of this type of terrain that we're in, or this type of location that we're in. So it's sort of that, it takes the the fantasy factor not out, but it makes it relatable for everyone when you see that piece of terrain on the table and people can look and they can get in closer and they can touch it and they can move things around and start interacting with it, because it's basically helping them create their own memories in this place that's been created. And because it becomes more solid, more tangible to work with, it helps them feel more established and knowledgeable in what they would be doing with their own character at that time, and maybe what their character did before the campaign. And, well, maybe they lived in a place like this and they had this particular job, or they interacted with these people at the tavern and things like that. So I think, once you make it something where it can be physically interacted with, it makes it less floating above your head and kind of like, well, I guess kind of maybe, especially for people just starting out and getting into the game.
Yeah, one of the biggest issues that Theater of the Mind games tend to have for me is that the edges tend to stay foggy. They tend to stay a little out of focus. And a lot of times with a good DM and good players, you can kind of jump out and identify one of those foggy things if it needs to happen for the story or whatnot. And everybody's generally okay with it as long as you're not trying to go too far outside the box. But for the most part, everything else tends to kind of stay out of focus. But terrain really helps you bring everything kind of into sharp relief. You can look and say, oh, okay, I understand the relationship of where I am to everything else very, very, very well now. I know how far away the stable is. I can see that if I run down here and turn to the right, I'll run into a crowd of bad guys. That helps inform a lot of the decisions and helps you really get immersed in what's going on. If you're not constantly having to kind of worry about how long is the hallway, okay, how many doors were on this side versus that side, and how many bad guys are left. If you're not constantly having to think of that kind of stuff, you can think about things like what this place smells like, what's going on that's not directly involved with the miniatures. So you can say, oh, I think there would be a crate right here, or maybe there is actually a crate right there. So instead of taking another sword swipe, I'm actually going to run over and push that crate over on top of these 3 guys. Is that something I can do? And a lot of times in a game that's Theater of the Mind, that kind of stuff isn't laid out as part of the description. And some players don't understand that it's okay to establish that kind of stuff as a player.
Yeah, definitely. And it helps, especially when you've had the more experienced players who are perfectly fine with Theater of the Mind because they're used to that setup. But when you have the new players come in with the more experienced players, it's sort of it gives common ground to everyone, literally, because you can see the ground and the layout. And then you also find that people are more willing to be the outside of the box thinkers, as opposed to, I walk another 20 feet down and I turn to my right. What do I see? It gives something to work with, but also to expand at the same time. Some people think it's limiting, but I actually have found that when the terrain's there, it's become almost permissive, because you can see what's there and work with different concepts that you may not, as you said, think of by just keeping it in the head.
And again, with a lot of like with a lot of other tools, it helps to kind of establish boundaries, to kind of firmly let your players know this is the sandbox that we're playing in. If everything on the table terrain-wise is all Arabic themed, then that really drives a lot of the expectations and the common language that's used in play. There's a lot of shorthand that kind of happens that way, so that you don't have to constantly be explaining, oh yes, this person is also wearing a turban, or this person is also speaking with a thick accent. You don't have to constantly reiterate a lot of the stuff because it's represented already, and most people kind of are able to look and take that logical leap and get everybody on the same page.
Definitely.
Awesome. Well, so let's get to one of the preloaded questions here.
Sure.
The first one is from DM Scotty McFarland.
Woohoo! Don't know that
is in the chat.
Yeah, it looks like.
Don't know him?
I have no idea who he is. None.
I think somebody knows him.
Oh, yeah.
All right. He says, is it better to make minimal backstory and then build on it in the campaign? Or do you prefer a detailed backstory that the DM has to weave in?
Both. I find, because I play in a lot of one shots, so for me to create a backstory for every single character that I've had to create from, the fall until now, I'd have a stack of books on my hands. But I have found that for like the one shot backstory, there we go. It's easier for me to kind of give a looser backstory where it's sort of an approximation of, where would they be from, what would sort of drive them and everything like that. Because really you're looking at maybe 2 to 4 hours tops working with this PC. So as long as I have enough to kind of give me an idea of who they are, what kind of makes them do what they do, and what would be like their likes and their dislikes and their preferences, things like that, that's enough for me. Like literally, if I can get it down like 2 paragraphs tops, wonderful. If I know it's going to be a long run campaign where it's going to persist beyond 3 or 4 sessions, then yeah, I find it very helpful to have a stronger backstory, because you don't want to come into a campaign with a PC who's kind of flim flam, and you have this one concept, but because of the way the campaign's going to persist, you're like, well, who am I playing? What am I doing? Why am I doing this? It takes you almost longer to sort of catch up and get your PC where you want them to be for something that is going to be there for a long time. So when I know it's going to be something that's longer, yeah, then I'll sit down and I'll look over those. Sometimes DMs will send me prompts and I'll look through those questions that they have for me. Sometimes I just sort of sit there and I literally just dive back into my own creative writing in the past and think about the things like the who, what, where, why, when, and the, again, the likes, the dislikes, the favorite color, the favorite smell, the, fondest memory as a child, things like that. I will literally put into, I'll send the DM a separate backstory, because I'm not going to send them pages upon pages upon pages. That's, their time is valuable. But for myself, I will literally let this character live in my head and let them kind of tell me after a while of developing them, well, this is what I like to do. This is something I absolutely cannot stand seeing. And by getting that character more fleshed out, it makes them so much easier to play when game time comes around. So it's a little bit of this from column A and a little bit of that from column B, depending on the situation itself.
Yeah, and that's a great way to distinguish between the two, because yeah, with a one shot, you shouldn't spend more time putting the character together than you're playing the game. Mm-hmm. And often I think some people miss that. So for one shots, I'm very similar. I use a lot of art that I find online, and I love finding a good character portrait. And usually if the portrait is good enough, it's something where it's not just a good looking portrait. It's got personality. It says something. And the moment that I see it, a story kind of starts to jump off of the screen at me. That's usually one that I'll grab and save and put away for later. And then when I go to build a character, I'll go find one of those and be like, oh, okay, yeah, this guy is a such and such. Mm-hmm. And I'll actually sit down and look at the picture, study the face, study the things they have on their belt, the way their clothing's made, all of that kind of stuff. And it informs a lot of that kind of stuff for me. Everything from the personality to the voice to a lot of things that they've been through. I just start making up a lot of that kind of stuff in my head. And now very rarely do I actually write any of it down, other than like the traits and flaws and bonds and whatnot on the character sheet. And I do like to let a lot of the character evolve organically in the campaign. And a large part of that is about where that character is going to fit in the scheme of the narrative and the dynamic of the party. Talmud, as an example, I didn't have in my head that he was going to be this comedic pratfall kind of character. But that's just kind of the way that things started kind of developing as far as his die rolls. And it was something that felt like the group kind of needed, those moments of levity and having a character who could be the butt of the joke, because we had a lot of characters who had some tragic things going on. And I don't mind playing that kind of character at all. I enjoy it. Yeah. So that definitely started shaping who Talmud was long after he had been created. But as a DM, for campaigns, I absolutely love to have very detailed, not necessarily detailed backstories, but everybody have a detailed understanding of who their character is, the way they fit into the world, and the way that they're going to fit into the party.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll do the same thing. I actually go onto Pinterest and I'll create boards for each character, especially like the ones that are going to be around for a while. Because I like getting the visual sense of who they are. But I also like making sure there's creating the backstory. And I think this is something people sometimes get confused with. There's the backstory. That's, basically backstory kind of equals history. Some people get so caught up in their backstory that it's like, this is gospel to what my character is going to do. No, not necessarily. Because are you the same person you were even a year ago because of what you've gone through in your own life? So it's when the backstory becomes almost the will be for a person. Like, I need my backstory. That's where having too detailed of a backstory can actually start impeding the player, because they forget it's like, no, you can let your character grow and develop and shift and change and discover, oh, well, I thought I was going to hate half orcs, but turns out this guy in the party is a really cool dude. Things like that. So backstories are wonderful implements to get you going, and they're wonderful implements to touch base with where it all started. But it's when you let them get too, like, if I were to get like a 5-page essay about a PC, I'd be worried, because then I'm going to be concerned, like, are you really going to get into this and be open to what the other players are going to bring in and how they might affect how your character does things? Or are you set that you're going to be the heroic, shiny armor paladin who will do no harm and always do good and ha-ha type of personality? Because, sometimes that can be shifted. But yeah, so it's always interesting to see the differences between a touch of a backstory, a very developed backstory, and then a far too developed backstory, and how it can affect the way things play out.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you have to be adaptable. This game is about being adaptable. And if you've locked your character into this destiny or whatever, where this has to happen or else it's not true to your character, or you get to a certain point and you're like, my character's now unplayable. Like, I can't play this person in this setting or in this story. Then the fault has to kind of land squarely in your lap. And it's something that you should have left enough wiggle room in your character's design and backstory so that you could, again, be adaptable.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So the purpose of a backstory, I think, is kind of to inform us of the history that has shaped the character into who they are in the present. So it's all about the past. But it does sometimes allude to possible motivations, personality, fears, knowledge they may have. So as a player, you've spoken of this a little bit, but what is your typical process when you're developing a character for a longer term game?
The first thing I will do, this is for every single PC, I will figure out what the race is first, and then sort of consider, okay, so this is the race I'm falling into, start thinking about personalities or expectations and things like that after reading through the information about that particular one. And then from there, it's like, well, what would make the most sense for them in terms of class? And then delve into the classes. And it's once I get those two pieces put together, that's where it's like, okay, so I have this, I have my, what is she? She is a halfling rogue druid. And I play her over on Nerdarchy. And it was one of those things where I was like, okay, well, how'd she get here? Because I knew I wanted to multi-class for purposes of sort of a metagaming factor of helping out the party, making sure there was someone who could heal, but also someone who could pick locks. But I'm kind of like, okay, so this is a little different. How did she get here? So I started thinking about, okay, so she's a rogue first. So she likes being sneaky. Well, why was she sneaky? What was going on with her life that she wanted to be sneaky? And I also kind of set a challenge for myself with each PC. And this particular challenge was she had to have a happy childhood. I'm like, she's not going to have a tragic backstory. So I was like, okay, so what is it that Tylea was doing where she would be sneaky, yet the childhood was happy? And it's like, well, she's right smack in the middle of a family of 9 kids. So she wanted her own space. So she'd sneak out of the house and sneak into the woods so her siblings wouldn't follow her, and she'd have her own little time and thing. And because of spending all that time in the woods, she also got comfortable being in the woods. And it was starting that process of here's my end point, but let's get back to beginning point. That's really how I really work each of my characters. And again, that little nuance of, well, what's my challenge for this one? And it helps me sort of weave the story to make sense with who they are and what they're doing, and giving them the reasons why they're doing some of the decisions that they're making and some of the actions that they're taking and things like that. So I definitely always want to start off first with the race in the class, and then I sort of backpedal from there. And it just helps me sort of feel grounded. It's like, so I've gotten here, but how is really what helps me shape the backstory. And again, sometimes DMs, they'll send me questions, and, you know, simple things like, you know, how old are you? What do you look like? Why did you become an XYZ? And things like that. They start prompting you as well to think more about your character and why you're doing what you're doing with them. And also thinking about, well, how are they going to start fitting into this story based upon the questions that the person's presented to you as the DM GM factor as well. So that's really, it's a very convoluted process, I guess, because once I start, especially with the longer ones, once they start building, like I said, they'll live in my head for a while, and it's like literally like the voice starts to develop and the appearance starts to develop and the mannerisms and the quirks, and just kind of letting them surface, really.
Yeah, you have to understand them as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once you get to the point where you understand them as a person, the way that you would understand a character from a television show or a book that you really, really like, you have to really kind of be able to understand them well enough that when something is thrown their direction, you don't have to stop and think, well, wait a second, how would this person respond? You know how they would respond instantly. You're like, no, this is exactly what they would do. Even if it may not be an optimal choice as a player, you can understand, no, this is definitely who this person is, and this is the direction that they're going to be going, unless something else stops them from doing so.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think there's a certain level of comfort that comes from understanding your own character that way, because then you can slip back into their skin very easily.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot of fun to play because then you get wrapped up in a scene, and sometimes you finish and you're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said those things, but it made sense for the character.
And that's just, I mean, well, like, you know, with our game, that one time where Jake had to go and do something, and Griffith and Cantriell got into a row, and it was hysterical. And it's one of those things where Jake came back in a panic, and he thought we were yelling at each other, like, well, no, we're just kind of letting them do their thing. And it made sense for them to have that moment because it was something that was coming down the pipeline anyways. But, you know, I jokingly say, like, before I start a game, regardless of whether it's the one we playing together or the other games that I'm in each week, I have to get into so-and-so's mind. I try and give myself about an hour to kind of slip into, especially with Cantriell. Like, I try and give myself about an hour to sort of get into this sassy, brassy pistol of a creature, because she's a fun one to play, but she's also challenging because she's so quick-witted, because she's so like, forget it, I'm just going to do my own thing. Where I am naturally more methodical and observant, and I'll want to take in things every so often. And once I'm comfortable with the group, then yes, I'll be sarcastic and let all that come out. But she's just right from the word go. Like, she just shoots it off and she's off and running with it. So for me, it's like, okay, get back into Cantriell. But the funny thing is, she's the hardest one to pull out of when the game's done. Like, I have to be careful when I'm like reading comments and stuff to be like, nope, don't answer now, because it's going to be very feisty and very cruel and very nope. So it's funny how the different PCs that you even play, you develop a relationship with your own PC in a very not odd, but it's a very intimate interaction you're going to have with something of your own creation. But they do take on almost a 3D factor of a living, breathing, thoughtful creature of their own existence because of everything you're doing with them in the game.
Yeah, for sure. They're made up of a part of you. Even if it's a part of you that's buried really deep, or that you don't want to admit is actually a part of you. Usually a character that you develop and one that you develop well, that where you can actually start to feel this knowing them, there's the familiarity is like a reflection of a part of yourself. And it may be exaggerated and, you know, carried out to immense proportions, but that's, you know, that's part of the fun of it. But I think that's important because that lets us explore those parts of ourselves. in a way that is not going to be socially damaging or physically damaging, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean it's easier to land in a fake world than it is to have to land hard in the real world on concrete with everyone staring at you. That's for sure. But you know, it's almost it's the more you create and the more you do, it's almost second nature now to start creating these characters. And it's like, oh, I can touch base with them. It's like, you know, kind of going out and having a cup of coffee with a friend at this point, depending on which PC you're playing.
So most players, I have noticed, tend to create a backstory for their character separately from the rest of the group. However, something that I've been adopting for my own campaigns is an approach that builds the characters' backstories together as a group. Which method do you prefer? And what strengths and weaknesses would you say that these two different approaches have?
I have been actively involved in doing both. And when it comes to a situation where you know you're all coming into this cult, like your characters have never met or anything like that, it helps to have your independent backstory where you really do know the story itself and who this PC is. But then I've been in a couple campaigns where no, they know each other, they have a history, and I've sat down with the other player and it's like, okay, so this is our relationship. Well, how'd we get here? But what would we do if something were to happen with a relationship? Or you just sort of present questions to each other and start creating the nuances of being, you know, whether it's siblings, whether it's, you know, parent child, or, you know, they were friends, but then they are no longer friends for reasons type of stuff. They each have their own challenges, though, because I find when you've made the backstory just for your one character and you're being pulled into a campaign, you might realize it's like, oh, geez, I kind of made this backstory that's really kind of focused on not liking this particular type. And look who's sitting across the table. So that's where you realize that you were going to have this PC who was going to be fixated on kind of pshawing and feeling superior to. And you're like, oh, I might have to make some growth and changes with this character because they're going to be interacting with this personality that they've pretty much already had in their mind. Well, I don't like the, you know, the fighter type or whatever, just pulling out a random thing. I have nothing against fighters. So that's one of the impediments I found with your, you know, you don't really communicate with the players first when you're creating your backstory. It's like, oh, well, I've kind of put something in my backstory that really might be a sticky wicket with other players. You know, that's where it's like, do I want to omit this? Do I want to hold true to it? How do I want to deal with this when working with a party? You know, I found with working with other people and creating a backstory together, probably the impediment in that factor is sometimes people have different interpretations on what the characters would do because of that connection. It's like, well, you're my fill in the blank. Why didn't you? It's like, yeah, I may be your, let's say, sister, but it doesn't mean that she would do this willingly because you're doing this action that she considered, you know, kind of poor choice and, you know, illegal. So there's just, you have to make sure there's great communication when you've built a backstory up with someone else. You have to make sure you're touching base with someone when you know that your stories are so woven together that you almost have to breathe at the same tempo when it comes to certain parts of playing out those two roles together. But again, when you've become so engrossed in creating this own character and you haven't really met the party yet, it's a little bit more jarring when you realize it's like, oh, I could have done so much more with this had I have spoken with so-and-so about what they were doing. So they have their trade-offs, they have their strengths, they have their weaknesses. But I think it's important to do both because otherwise it's almost going to become a limiting factor when you're placed in a different situation where the DM's like, hey, I want you to pair up with one of the other players and create a backstory together. And you're like, but this is my story. Or if you're so used to playing with other characters and they're like, okay, so create this character and come back to us and we're going to start playing. There's no session zero. We're just going to go from the word, you know, hey, everybody. And that can be intimidating to other people. It's like, because I thought I was going to have someone else to kind of like know ahead of time. And how are they going to do this? What if they want to meet people? Like, so it's just, I think doing both is very key, especially for learning how to grow as a player too.
I've definitely found that for me, the sweet spot is certainly somewhere in the middle. I think creating a backstory for your character in a vacuum leads to, I don't want to say the word dangerous, but it leads to pitfalls. And I think one of the big issues is it kind of tends to create conflicts and goals that are private. And even if you get the chance to actually fulfill those through the game, most of the experiences doing so tend to be very isolated for your character as well, because nobody else understands or is connected to what's going on in any way. But if you have, that your father was a captain of the city guard miles and miles away, and you also established up front that somebody else's PC happened to also be a guard in the same city at the same time, now he knows your father. All of a sudden, that simple little mention becomes a very nicely woven complexity in the fabric of the party, and it's something you can then build on top of.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I would recommend just once playing a character with amnesia, because I had a PC who she had no recollection of her past whatsoever for reasons. All I knew about her was that she was security, because this took place in the dark matter, which is a reskin of D&D to be like space-based. Lots of fun. But she was in security. She was a lieutenant commander. So I knew she was regimented. I knew she was very much straight and narrow type, but she'd lose her cool because she was a barbarian. So that's really all I knew about her. But the interesting thing was, because she had this amnesia factor, there were times I'm like, how would she react to this? Because she has no basis to work off of. So at this moment in time, would she flip out or would she keep her cool? Because she had two very different sides to her. But the cool thing about not having a backstory whatsoever beyond her name, her rank, and her position on the ship was that her story got created because she was interacting with these other PCs, because she was meeting different NPCs, because it was also a game where new players would come in every week. So because she was meeting someone new every single week, each of those PCs began to affect her backstory. So her backstory was essentially being created at the same time as playing her. And then the DM wove in some crazy mind-bending stuff on top of it. And I found out a whole bunch about her at the very end. But that was an enlightening experience, going in really not knowing this character and why they're doing what they're doing, because it makes you really think about how you're going to role play. Which, if you're intimidated by role playing, going cold turkey is really going to force you to do it and not rest on it. Like, oh, I've already thought about this. They just do this. It really gets you thinking in game. Okay, how is she going to react? How are they going to do this? Why would they do that? So that's something I do recommend to people. Just try once, just one time. Get out of that comfort zone of having the backstory and drop it all together.
Yeah, that's an interesting piece of advice. Like I said, a lot of the times I don't necessarily create a large amount of backstory ahead of time for most of my characters now, unless it's asked by the DM. But one without any backstory whatsoever would certainly be would be different.
Mm-hmm. It's a very different experience. I wouldn't recommend doing it for every single player. Nope. No. But just giving it a try, especially if you know it's going to be a shorter thing, it's kind of cool, especially because of the interaction factor with other PCs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a talking point that I'll bring up in just a second, dealing specifically with that. But first, I want to get to one of the other preloaded questions. Yeah. This is one of the ones from Alan Holloway.
Oh, okay.
And he asks, hold on, I need a drink first.
No, you're not allowed.
Well,
you gotta croak your way through, dude.
I'm running this circus.
I know. Where are the monkeys? I want the monkeys.
All right, here we go. So, what are your thoughts on character questionnaires as part of your session 0? What types of questions do you like to focus on, both as a player and as a GM? Do you prefer questions about their history and relationships, or do you prefer questions that are more centered around goals and motivations?
Yeah, I actually have had a couple of games where I've been sent a questionnaire. I find them helpful more so because it gives me a sense of where the DMGM's coming from and getting a sense of what their focus might be in terms of incorporating things of your backstory into the campaign. I especially like it when it's actually the blend of what's your history, literally how old are you? Do you have siblings? Do you have parents and everything like that? But also what drives you to do what you do, or what brought you to this point where you're starting off in the beginning of the game. the questions that sort of the easy ones, like, yes, my mother's name is, my sibling's name is, those are good to have just as like quick, easy guide reference that the DM can work it into the game. But then having the questions where you have to pause and really be reflective and analyze your character more, I think those are good too, because it gets you into a mindset of, you know, this is probably something I'm going to be looking at as a player in this game. So as a DM, GM, I'd recommend things like, you know, what are you passionate about? What would enrage you? What do you feel is, you know, morally correct in this situation? Like, just quick little questions that really get you to pause and critically think. A couple of those are good because it is going to make you get more into the character. And as a player, I appreciate things like, you know, have you ever been to this country before where this is going to be taking place? And it's like, okay, so am I established here, or am I a stranger in a new world type of thing? So again, I like the blending of the two. I think if you stick too much to the dry, the factoid, let's do a biography type of thing, it's going to be like, yeah, you're going to know all this trivia. Essentially, it's trivia about your character, but you're not going to have a sense of who your character is. But if you have those questions that make you analyze and process and think reflectively, that's going to already start getting you to develop your character that much further before you even if you do a session 0 or you just jump right into game with your first session.
There's a fantastic game, a horror game that you play with a Jenga tower called Dread. And it's it's probably the best game that I have ever seen as far as setting up your character and who they are up front. They have these very, very pointed questions. Actually, the entire book for the role-playing game has these questions on the bottom of every page, just kind of scattered throughout the entire thing. And you can just kind of flip through and pick however many that you want for to present your characters with. And it's something that I have stolen wholeheartedly for my own campaigns, even for Dungeons and Dragons. And I usually will drop like a 10 question questionnaire with for each of my characters, and they're all bespoke to that character.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I get their backstory, whatever they might be thinking. Oh, I want to play, you know, a human wizard who, you know, studied in a tower that was destroyed by orcs, and now he's looking for his family. Okay. And then I'll start tailoring all of the questions towards that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I like really, really focused questions. Not all of them have to be this focused, but things like, who was the last person you killed?
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
So things that you may not have thought about, that you wouldn't normally
Mm-hmm.
think about, but now you have to kind of come up with an answer, even if it's, oh, I've never killed anybody.
Mm-hmm.
That's perfectly fine. But at least you've had to stop and think and decide that.
Yeah. I also like it when it's I've had this a couple times now. Give me 3 what will be NPCs, 2 who you have a good relationship with, and 1 who you have as an adversary of some shape or form of another. Those I actually like because it takes your character that much further than just beyond a self-centered analysis. It's, oh, wait, relationships. Yeah. Who would these people be? And then suddenly you have to give them names. And even if it's just like, I just want a name and what that relationship was like, and then letting the DM, GM build on those NPCs. I like those a lot thrown in as a player, because you're realizing, okay, so this is something of my start creation that I'm going to see possibly come back and take on a life of their own, because it's now become a collaborative NPC essentially. But yeah, I do like seeing those in questionnaires for sure.
Yeah, that's actually another thing that I have taken to asking my players for ahead of time is definitive connections to the world before the campaign starts. Like you mentioned, connections with PCs within the party. Having players invent NPCs that have a connection to their character, whether that's good or bad. And I usually get a secret from everyone. It doesn't even have to be something that your character is aware of, just something that is going on in the background that may or may not lead to trouble down the road. And I have found that the story of a campaign can then be kind of crafted around these connections. So instead of it just being a throwaway NPC that you happen to invent, now whenever you need that, you know, twisted evil priest, you have, you know, one in somebody's backstory that you can go to and say, now they're the same person.
Yeah.
And whenever they come up in the game, there's going to be a very, very strong hook set in the player who gave you that information of being involved. You know, it's not going to be oh, who cares? He's a corrupt priest. It's like, no, I know this SOB and he's got to go down, you know, for this reason.
I mean, I have a Alice. She's amazing with the way she weaves stories. She actually took, because she had that in one of her questionnaires, she took some of our NPCs, and because there were common points, what was 2 NPCs actually became 1. And she created this person because of the different inputs, which then suddenly made our PCs have a connection and became a driving point. So it was really, it's one of those things where she's revealing it. I think like the first couple episodes were like with our mouths open half the time. But as a GM sending out these questions, it's something to be cognizant of, that when these NPCs come back, it doesn't mean they have to be all a whole bunch of different NPCs. They could be merged together, and suddenly you have this NPC that means a lot more to more than just one player too, and becomes even more important to the campaign because of that.
I think that's actually one of the strongest tools that you can have as a GM. And you've actually hit on it a second time now. It's when you have these 2 ideas or pieces of information that at first seem juxtaposed or unconnected. So how would a character be both a rogue and a druid, to cite your earlier example? But generally, the strength of a story comes from how you can have both of these pieces of information be true at the same time. The good stuff, the gravy, is that bridge that connects those 2 independent things and makes them both possible. Mm-hmm. And I think if you can get that down as a tool, it's probably, I would say for me as a DM, it's one of my most valuable, most used tools at the table.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Okay. So we have one more preloaded question. This one is from Alan Holloway again. What types of questions do you like to ask the players as a group when making backstories that can help you with world building?
For me, I've kind of landed in this, it's a one-shot type of deal for me. But whenever I have players coming into the game, I'll have them as like, okay, well, where are you right now and how did you get here? Because I'm going to pull them into something else completely different. So for me, it helps to have an establishment. Okay, so they see themselves as this type of a character. So it's questions like, what's the motivating questions? So why are you here? What have you done? How would you be known? What would others notice about you? Is there anything distinguishable about you that's a little bit different? Like, do you have an accent? Do you walk a certain way? Do you wear a certain thing? Is there, a leg you favor due to an old injury? Things like that. I especially like to get those little nuances to give more of a sense of who these are as people, even though they're PCs, but who they are as people is really what I sort of hone in on as a DM, because it's I do more of a role play style game. Yes, there's still combat and stuff, but a lot of it is more, you also need to think outside the box. So I like people having a sense of who each player is, because more often than not, it's a whole bunch of different people coming in as total strangers. There's no way to connect them together. So knowing it's like, oh, okay, well, I have someone who's like this, I might relate to them because of that, which is why I try and get ahead of time in the very beginning. It's like, okay, well, describe to us who we're going to see right now. And once they start describing that, it's like, okay, and what would they be doing? What would they be noticing? What would you be drinking? Even something like that. You're at the bar. What do you order? Things like that will get people connecting with each other. So as the DM, I like the little tiny hints of details that get put into the character, because those little things I like to pull into the fact. It's like, oh, well, you ordered this drink before and you just got through that really tough ass bad guy. And here comes the bartender and she's just going to plunk your favorite drink into your hand and kind of give you a pat on the back. It's her way of letting you know that, yeah, you're good with her type of thing. So I like the nuances. I definitely like those little tiny touches, because to me, I feel it makes the world that much more immersive, because it's not just a journal. I'll have an ale. It's like, well, which ale do you want? And here's a whole list of the ales. What are you going to pick? Things like that.
How much do you lean on your characters or your players for informing parts of the world outside of themselves, outside of their character? Or do you?
Well, with BBs, it's very much a sandbox that's been established, but it's fun to see what they lock onto. I've had NPCs where I've pictured them playing out a certain way, but then seeing how the characters are responding to them, I'm like, you know what? Let's spin this. Because this was supposed to be an NPC who was the good guy and going to help him out, but they are convinced they're like the double agent type of thing. I'm like, all right, let's see what happens with it. And then another NPC who is supposed to be the bad guy, they've actually converted, and they found out that they were, being held under duress and being, blackmailed by the bigger bad guy and type of thing. So I'll have concepts in my head. So it's not so much the environment that's malleable, but the NPCs that are floating around in that world. They can be shifted a little bit based upon what I'm seeing from their responses and how they're reacting to just those little things, which has been fun. And it's been really cool to see the shifting and the changing. I think as a DM, as a GM, you have to remember, it's like, yes, you've created this world, but they've also jumped into it with you. So the story, the second you have other people jumping in, it's become collaborative. It's become a give and take. It's become a weaving of tales together where, for as much time as you put in, respect the fact that they're putting in time as well. So it's when something's like, well, that's not how I pictured it in my head. Well, unless you're telling them every single little thing and, chugga chugga, get on board, everybody, it's not going to stay the way you've pictured it in your head. Things like a building, that can stay pretty much static. It's like there's a door, there's a window, there's a staircase. But how they interact with the person standing by the door, how they get to the staircase when there's this big guy standing in the way, all of that can change based upon interactions. So I think that's where having that in mind is also important too.
I think that allowing your players to create within your world is every bit as important as making sure that you don't create your character's backstory in a vacuum. You cannot create a fully fledged world on your own. There are just too many nooks and crannies. There's just too many finite details to be able to come up with on your own. But your players can do a lot of the lifting for you. And more than likely, if it involves their character, especially, they're going to be willing to do it because it enriches their experience at the table and it makes their character cooler, usually. So when a character comes to you and says, hey, I want to play a fighter and I'm going to be a soldier, but I really want to have served in this really large conflict, this big battle, this big famous battle that everybody knows about, but you didn't have anything planned like that in the history of your world or, in the campaign that you're running. If it doesn't undo anything that's absolutely imperative to your what you have planned and you can work with it, then work with it.
Exactly. I will go into a game with an outline because the world itself, I know it. I know what it looks like in my head. I can describe it. I can get everyone to the same point in the, you're in this part of the bar, you're downstairs in the basement in the wine cellar, and giving them the NPCs so they know what they look like, what they sound like, their quirks and their mannerisms. But I love seeing how they are reacting because those reactions help me see where this game can go for them. And honestly, I love that part because it just takes things to a different level. It's like, oh, okay, so Bugle player is the bad guy. All right, I'm kind of liking this. Wasn't expecting it. He was supposed to be up on the stage with a piano player and they were supposed to play some jazz, but cool. To me, it's fun having that surprise element of like, holy crap, you just took it there and I had no idea it was going to go there. Because to me, those become even more memorable as a result.
Absolutely. And it increases the ownership of the player because, years down the road when they're retelling the stories about, this event that they lived through, they can be like, oh yeah. And then do you remember, so-and-so, stepped out of the back room and it was the guy that, had done the thing to me. And they won't remember the fact that you might have come up with it or that they might have come up with it, but it becomes real because it is part of their story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think allowing them to try things out and letting them have that motivation helps them develop the characters, but it also helps solidify this world even more so each time, even if it's like with this one-shot game, even though it's a different group each and every single time, the decisions they've made and the stories they've created in that world, I now make a point of keeping as the history of BB's place, which is tons of fun for me to throw in like just passing comments that the NPCs can use. You know, and the new PCs can come in like, oh, okay, cool. So it boils down to backstories are fantastic things to have. They absolutely help. Even as a DM, every single one of my NPCs has a backstory. It's just how I function. But like you said, don't let it become the vacuum where you're just like, but this is how it's supposed to be. You know, the second the frustration kicks in between player and DM, where it's like, you know, this is not how the DM wanted to be, and the player's getting frustrated because they want to try this, and it's like, just play it out and see how it goes. Or it's like, okay, so this may not be the direction you want them to take, diversion or redirect, that type of thing. But don't get too comfy with the concept like this is how it was supposed to play out. Because quite frankly, you never know how it's going to play out because you've just added in 4 to 5 new people who are going to add in their own elements. So it's backstories are wonderful things, but they're not gospel, which I said before.
Yeah, they're hammered into clay. They're not carved in stone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that's everything that I have, V. So, yeah, thank you very, very much for coming on and agreeing to do this and let me fire questions at you. So, yeah, thank you everybody for tuning in and for anybody who may be watching in the future. So, V, why don't you go ahead and do your outro? Again, you can tell people where to find you, plug anything that you want to plug, and we'll put a bow on it.
All right, cool. So for those of you who joined us after the intro, I am V, the Crafting Muse. I have a YouTube channel. I'll show you how to make miniature terrain, how to paint minis, and make game accessories for your tabletop role-playing games. You can also find me over on Mini Terrain Domain as well as Straticus Academy over on Twitch. I am a player on both channels, and I love it. And let's see, I am also going to be a DM at D&D in a Castle for the Caverswall Castle at the end of June, which is literally a month away almost, which is unreal. So you'll also find me over on Twitter and Facebook and in the Tabletop Crafters Guild. I'm one of the guild masters. Please come over and join us if you're interested in getting into crafting. We'd love to have you there and have you share your creations with us. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I'm sure there is, but you know, find me, the Crafting Muse, pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, she gets around quite a bit on social media. She's a social media in a good way. In a good way. Yes, and we almost made it through.
I know.
She's a social media butterfly. But yes, well, yeah, I'll see you on Thursday, V, and we'll get up to our usual antics, I'm sure.
I can't wait.
Awesome. So looking forward to it. All right, everyone. Thank you very, very much for tuning in. And until next time, may your dice roll high and your snacks always be within reach.